Thanks very much for the introduction, Jason. I don't know whether I'm that infamous. Done some pretty infamous things in Indonesia probably, but we won't talk about them today. Look, it's really great to see so many producers, and welcome to the school kids who are here today. So what schools are you from? And all from Townsville Bay, so we've got some from Charters Towers, I think, or not? Excellent. Look, if you guys want to ask any questions throughout the time, it'd be great to answer your questions, because we really need you guys to get a good understanding of what happens in live export. So look, Jason has introduced the panel. Brooke, Dan, Michael and Valeska all have a huge amount of depth of knowledge in the marketplace, and that's what you as producers want to know about, what's happening to your cattle in the marketplace and how that you can benefit more from what's happening in that marketplace and by selling cattle better into the marketplace. So what we'll hope to do today, and please, I'll probably just ask one question to each of the panel here, and then we'll throw the floor open. So at any stage you'd like to ask some questions, please feel free to put your hand up and ask questions, and the roving mic will come around. So I might just talk to Dan first, as Dan's been in the industry. He's owned a couple of places, or numerous places for a number of years. And Dan, you've spent a little bit of time in the marketplace, both Indonesia and Vietnam and the Philippines over the last 20 years. What have you seen progress in time over that time? I know in my time in Indonesia, I've seen quality of cattle improve dramatically. As we heard from Austrax this morning, the quality of facilities have improved dramatically in the last 25 years, and with improved facilities come improved cattle comfort, and that's what we're all about, is cattle comfort, because happy cattle or comfortable cattle means profitable cattle. Dan, what have you heard about, or what have you seen?
I'd like to share your mic. I think, like everyone, most producers have been over to Southeast Asia and seen the emerging markets over there. But I was just fortunate enough earlier this year to go to Vietnam, and it is where I saw the Philippines and Indonesia were sort of 10, 15 years ago. It's an emerging market, and fairly exciting, because obviously the potential growth there is quite exponential. But anyway, what was one of the real surprises in Vietnam was the couple of kill facilities that I visited. Well, there's more than a couple, but they had very, very high standards, and they were quite successfully value-adding the product from those kill facilities. So that, to me, was very encouraging. They've obviously got a extensive wet market, but they could value-add products, so therefore we've got the potential to, they've got the potential to value-add and sell a higher-priced product.
So, Michael, you've spent a lot of time in Vietnam, and you're a vet, and so you're right throughout the supply chain there. So you've seen right from unloading of the cattle through the feedlots and then through the processing facilities. What sort of things to producers that you take into market want to see? And I know it's always a pleasure to take people into a feed yard in Indonesia and show them their cattle. What do people ask you about what's happening in the supply chains over there?
Yeah, look, so everybody's clear about what we do. I run the live export program. Asia Pacific manager, was in Vietnam based in Ho Chi Minh for 4 years, and now out of Singapore for the Asia Pacific region. So we run the MLA Live Corp joint program over there. And from our perspective, we're essentially facilitators of opportunity. So looking at where those opportunities are through the supply chain, and seeing from our insights of how markets are changing, or from our understanding of those markets, where the bottlenecks are and where opportunities are within those supply chains. And really our opportunity from our perspective is that we're not bound to specific commercial supply chains or to specific parts of the supply chain. So we're not producers looking at our profitability as producers. We're not abattoirs in Vietnam looking at profitability of abattoirs, and we're not exporters looking at the profitability of their specific part or the compliance within their supply chains. We can look across supply chains and throughout the supply chain. So I guess that's my long way of trying to get to your answer, to your question of what do we think the value in is for producers, and adding to Dan's point, these markets are changing rapidly, and there's opportunities throughout the supply chain, but we need to have a full supply chain approach. So for producers, the opportunity is understanding that you are one element of the supply chain, but you're an important element of all of the supply chain, and that there are bottlenecks at different points. For instance, we can't just start feeding cattle, or we can't bring in Wagyu cattle into these markets because the market doesn't demand Wagyu cattle there. We have nowhere to sell those animals. So we have instances where we've brought in high yielding, really beautiful Angus cattle, and they actually downgraded in price in the market in Vietnam because the specific market they were going into and the supply chain they were going into wants lean cattle. So where it is for producers is the opportunity for us to help you to understand the supply chain, the demands and the bottlenecks of how you integrate into that supply chain, and really looking into the future of how we can make you an element of the entire supply chain going forward.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, that's exactly it. The producer is the most important part of the chain. So, if we take cattle to Indonesia, over the years we've seen weight gains in Indonesia go from 0.9 in the early 90s up to, there's some feedlots in Indonesia now getting 2 or close to 2. So we've seen a weight gain difference because of genetics, because of facilities, because of feeding, gone from 0.9 to 2 kilograms per day. And you talk about 100 days, that's putting an extra 100 kilograms of weight on an animal. And so that's a combination of factors. So it's the genetics and the producer producing a better animal, and it's the feedlots in Vietnam or Indonesia or wherever they may be producing a better product as it goes through. So Brooke, you're involved with the CPC JJAA joint venture feedlot in Indonesia. You've been there about 3.5 years, I think. What is commercially, what are feedlots doing in Indonesia to track data on cattle and to use that data to buy better cattle or to source better cattle? Is that happening, do you believe? And is there a value in it for a feedlot in Indonesia or Vietnam?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I definitely think there's value in the data flow throughout the supply chain. It's something I've probably worked a lot on over the last 3 years to try and be tracing that back, and I'm sure that all of the feedlots over in Indonesia and probably Vietnam as well know which cattle they're going to get better performance out of and where they're from. As far as getting that back to the producer, I think that's probably something that we could work more on, but ensure that at the same time we're working with the importers to make sure that they get benefit out of sharing that data as well.
My joint venture partner here for 28 years, Dickie Adiwaso, is in just down here. He's the old grey-headed man there. Dickie always talks, and I know I've always talked about it, is when you go and do something in a foreign land, there's 3 very important things to do. Your joint venture partner is the first one, your joint venture partner is the second one, and your joint venture partner is the third one. And so, look, as producers, I think if you're going to go and have a look or do something in a foreign country, it's all pretty confusing. The first thing is to get that relationship, get that partnership up and running, and I do believe we've probably fallen down in the partnership building a little bit in the last 10 years. There's a number of reasons for that, but in the main case, in the most important thing in the chain for that partnership is your exporter. So, you as a producer will either sell your cattle through an agent and then to an exporter, and then the cattle will go to the importer. But it's very, very important that is, the exporter does control so much of the supply chain, and they take so much risk and so much. Attention. Testing of the fire alarm system will now commence. Please
Disregard the following fire alarm.
Oh, we'll disregard that, yes. Keep calm, keep calm. Dan, I'll just get on to Valeska in a moment, but I just talked to Dan about that, producers with relationships with importers via an exporter. I know you've gone with exporters to in-country. Have you tried to maybe start a few of those relationships with importers?
No, I have, but I haven't run into a nice grey-headed gentleman like Dick yet to continue it on. And look, the other thing is, I think you need to have a physical presence in the country that you're going to set up the alliance with for quite some time, because what I've seen is initially the facilities and the feedlots and so forth are not real good at data collection and measuring things. So until you've got that going, it's near impossible to get a handle on production figures and so forth. So that's it's important to have a physical presence there, and you've got to be of a fair you've got to be a CPC to be able to sort of have the resources to do that.
So there's the alarm anyhow.
Warning, the fire alarm system is operated. Stand by for further... Emergency.
Right, I think we've done there anyhow. Valeska, you've been based in Indonesia for 5 years. I don't think I've ever heard a fire alarm go off in Indonesia during a presentation, but anyhow, it's preparation is a great thing. Valeska, what are you doing in Indonesia to promote Australian cattle, and what are you doing with producers? That I know you do get a lot of in-country visits from producers. What are you doing as far as the LEP program and MLA in Indonesia and Vietnam in regard to promoting Australian beef or livestock?
Yes, I think that a lot of our cattle go overseas. And
Attention. Can all LIVEXchange delegates please make your way back to the conference as it is about to start. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
I think that's a very good promotion of LIVEXchange. So, yeah, a lot of our cattle and beef...
Attention. Go on. Sorry.
But in our roles, I think
us.
we are in a very unique position to be able to actually follow the product, the cattle from Australia right down to customer and right down to consumer. So in Indonesia, what we do through the livestock export program, we work across the supply chain, as Michael has said earlier, not just to lift the performance of individual players along the supply chain, but also to make sure that the product, the beef that is at the consumer's plate at the end of the day, really resonate with what we stand for. The Indonesian consumers are getting more sophisticated. No doubt that a lot of them are still going through the traditional channels to shop, for example, wet markets, etc. But they are really looking for quality these days. And Australian cattle, they stand for fresh, halal, safety, and locally produced. And I think those are attributes that we have a point of difference in Indonesia. And earlier we spoke about the competition that potentially Indian buffalo meat is bringing into the market. But I think that there's a lot of demand in there, and that the competitors will fill the bottom of the pyramid to start with. More people will be consuming beef. Indonesia is predominantly Muslim. And beef is the king of protein, and they are looking for the fresh halal slaughter, and that's what Australian we do in market to provide that. The LEP program has worked a lot over the years. We have over 3 decades of relationship with Indonesia. And I think as Sam pointed out earlier, that the people are getting more integrated into the supply chain. It's not just trade and transaction. It's actually building capability, working with them, mentoring them, and building up their confidence and leadership as well. So for example, in Indonesia, we have the initiative with the animal welfare officers. These are people who are on the front, the coal face of they are on the ground every day, every night. And these are the not just the importers, but also the exporters of in-market personnel. The animal welfare officers are now are sort of a solid group of people that are the eyes and ears to the ground. They are sharing their experiences. We facilitate workshops for them so that they can actually identify and come together to solve problems, but also come together to bond and to be part of the future leaders of the industry.
Thank you. So you touched on Indian buffalo meat there, and I think it's well worth mentioning Indonesia has been importing frozen boxed Indonesian buffalo meat for a bit over 2 years now. So I think it's around about 150,000 tonnes per year come in. It's a significant amount. It does dig into the live cattle market. Brazilian meat is also coming in probably in the next 2 to 3 months. And we're also seeing in Vietnam, and Michael, you might be able to touch on this, the talk that Brazil will import live cattle into Vietnam. So that's a threat to Australia. And I suppose it's all about price. So if Vietnam can produce meat cheaper by feeding them, they certainly will do them. But what have you heard about Brazilian Brazilian meat and Brazilian live cattle?
Look, so the reality is, from all of my understanding, and Brazil will get access for live animals into Vietnam, and the Vietnamese will import Brazilian cattle into Vietnam. I probably don't have any doubt about that. They're the type of people that will see how profitable it can be, to be honest, despite any feasibility studies we can do. For me, it's just appreciating that is probably going to be a reality. Doesn't matter what numbers we can throw at them. Where the opportunity for us is, and what we need to understand about these markets, is that there will be always external threats to our markets. You touched on Indian buffalo before. Vietnam's the largest importer of Indian buffalo in the world. A lot of it's transshipped into China, or most of it's transshipped into China, but if there was a market for it to remain in Vietnam, it would remain in Vietnam, and some of it does. And it has a specific place in Vietnam and has stabilised and has that position in Vietnam. A lot of regional cattle and local cattle are traded into the Vietnamese market, and they have a specific place within the Vietnamese market. Because of the way they are traded through the system, they can trade often more profitably through abattoirs through the Vietnamese system for various reasons. But the Australian cattle have a specific point of difference in the market because they are readily available in feedlots. The regional supply of cattle in the region is based on basically picking the eyes out of the system or trading cattle over the border on a daily basis and into abattoirs on essentially a daily basis, which is not a great way to build a sustainable business, to build reliable throughput through your abattoir or your supply chain. And it means that you're getting cattle that are of variable quality and size, and meat volumes and everything change on a daily basis. And the Australian cattle create the advantage of having a readily available source of animals that are healthy, of the same quality, of the same consistency, and that's our point of difference in the market. That point of difference has meant that abattoirs, when we're supporting them, can actually build throughput through their abattoirs. So we've gone from abattoirs when I started almost 5 years ago in the Vietnamese market. Abattoirs were roughly 5 to 10 head a night going through them, to a point now where our largest abattoir is doing 200 head a night. And there are a lot of abattoirs, and we're working towards most abattoirs doing 50 head a night, which is a massive shift in the market in Vietnam. And that's because cattle are now readily available, and buyers can rely on abattoirs to consistently have those cattle. We need to lean on our point of difference in the market. So in Vietnam, that is that consistency of cattle, and then we can start putting value onto it later down, as Dan's saying, through abattoir improvements and capturing greater value further down the chain. And as I said, it's whole chain, so we can start capturing and need to capture greater value from feeder animals into the market. But it's not as simple as we need to just provide feeder cattle in there, because those feeder cattle take time to feed up. So they need skills, and they don't have any cash flow for the time that they're feeding those animals. So that's a real constraint on the Vietnamese suppliers over there. I guess what I'm getting at is it's a complex market, and we need to understand all of those different elements to understand where the bottlenecks are to be able to address those specifically, so that we have a point of difference for our Australian cattle going into those markets.
Brooke, you're on the ground over there, so you see a lot of cattle coming into the feedlot. How do you look at the supply of cattle at the moment? Now, obviously you're seeing probably some drought-affected cattle coming into Indonesia at the moment, and those cattle usually feed very well. What can you talk to, or what you can tell producers about is what are your customers at the end looking for in an animal now? So, you know, there's been quite a change in the last 20 years from the high-grade Brahman through to the composites now. What are the customers at the end of the day at the facilities saying what they want in an animal?
The customers in Indonesia have moved towards a smaller animal. That's probably a big point of difference. You know, between 480 to 520 kilos is what most people are looking for. And I think that the composite cattle coming through, we're seeing higher weight gains and also higher carcass yield, which is really what our customers want. They want high carcass yield and lean as well, without putting too much fat on. So I think, yeah, crossbred and composite cattle are, as long as they've got enough Brahman content in them, are very welcome in Indonesia.
And what percentage of the cattle that you bring in are feeder cattle? You know, the Vietnamese market really desires that 550 animal, and most of them are leaving here at 550. What percentage are you bringing in as heavy animals, or most cattle coming into Indonesia now are feeder types or not?
Yeah, mostly feeder cattle. The margins are not really in it for slaughter cattle coming through those heavier 400 kilo animals.
And so
but we do take some,
quality is paramount there. The type of animal is very, very important that you get at that stage. And do you think there's an opportunity to give feedback to producers on their animals as they go out the farm gate, the feedlot gate over there? Is there some way that we could work together with producers? Obviously there would be a cost, because there's a cost involved in everything. Do you believe there might be an opportunity to do that or not?
Yeah, I do think that there'd be an opportunity. I'm not sure exactly how it would work, but I think the difference in cattle quality from one producer to another can swing by 0.6 to 0.8 of your tail end steers from a certain station doing 1.4 kilos a day to some of them doing 2. So I think there's definitely potential. I'm not exactly sure how it would work, but yeah.
Dan, have you got any comment on what would you like to see come out of the feedlots or the processing facilities in Indonesia? Would it benefit your operation, do you think, or not?
Look, with the standard of traceability now, providing the feedlot had some physical presence from the exporter here, I don't see why the data couldn't be collected and then, given back to producers, or the exporters would say, right, this line of cattle that this fella's producing is have done, better than another line of cattle, so therefore we could start maybe selecting for, I think, crossbred genetics would be the first thing, and getting some feedback. Yes, I think it could be done, but we would need a physical presence in most of those feedlot facilities to get that data, because it is difficult to get accurate data unless you've got a presence there.
We might throw it open to the floor. Is there any questions from producers in the floor that they'd like to ask? whether it be in regard to the LEP program, whether it be in regard to Brooke and her involvement in Indonesia. Peter Letchford.
Michael, you mentioned about the abattoirs in Vietnam, the capacity there. Is MLA putting money into helping to develop that? Those abattoirs, their capacity. What is that? Where some money is going?
So there's two aspects to that. Absolutely, in terms of the capability of those abattoirs, where the advantage comes in terms of actually directing change and delivering change into these markets is actually working with both the exporters and the importers to be able to understand how to impact on that change, again, from a supply chain perspective. So we are now working a lot closer with exporters, and this is really a more recent shift to work a lot closer with exporters to work out how the dynamics within their supply chains can capture greater benefit, specifically through select abattoirs, to build throughput through abattoirs. So we know in Vietnam throughput is a key, so building throughput through abattoirs is really important, both from a security for animal welfare perspective, because we've got less facilities to look at and easier to monitor, but also from a profitability perspective and competitiveness because of efficiencies of scale. So a lot of that work now is to build throughput through those facilities. And definitely we are investing with exporters to do that.
Is there any way that, like, if Brazil cattle come in, they're just going to piggyback on all the hard work that we've done and invested in those abattoirs? Is there any way that those abattoirs will show, or the feedlots that bring in the cattle, that's something we just have to wear and hope that the goodwill that we've created in creating the abattoir capacity, that we might get preferential treatment?
Look, so the quick answer is if we were always worried about somebody piggybacking on the good work that we do, you wouldn't do any work. So we need to be doing the work. There's no doubt about it. And the advantage is that through doing this type of approach, through building up secure supply chains that are reliant on the supply chain, it actually means that there becomes a reliance on the Australian cattle. So a lot of the work before, where we were just specifically looking at doing, say, animal handling capability training in individual facilities, was training capability for those staff members at a very low level. By building up throughput through facilities, it actually makes them reliant on a regular supply of cattle, and therefore they become reliant on Australian cattle. Now, with Brazilian cattle coming in, they can absolutely piggyback off of us, but the reality is with the Brazilian cattle, they're going to come in as heavy animals, and it's going to become a price-driven market. And my take on it is, given the availability of our cattle, it's probably going to be a little bit controversial, but maybe that might actually help with building throughput through those facilities anyway. So it might actually result in actually greater gains for us. It's not as simple as they're going to land and then go scatter to the wind. It might actually mean that because they're available, they're meeting that lack of supply that we can't provide to them because we don't have readily, heavily available slaughter cattle. And when those animals come back into the system, when Australia comes back into being competitive with price again, then we will just take it back again from them, because there won't be the relationship that we have with them anyway. So I don't know if that's controversial or not, but there is actually benefit in building up that throughput for us from an animal welfare perspective, but also from a long-term perspective, we're dealing with that market for live export.
No, thank you.
I think one of the big things is I doubt whether we'll see Brazilian cattle come into Indonesia because of the foot and mouth disease status. Indonesia is very, very conscious of the foot and mouth disease status. They're keen to source cattle from elsewhere, but foot and mouth is a risk. There's still 10 to 12 million cattle in Indonesia, local cattle in Indonesia, and about 2.5 million of those are processed every year. So the national herd is very, very important for Indonesia. But one of the most important things is and I hope, Vietnam is a little bit of a different one because everything is stunned in Indonesia, because there's no need for a halal status. So one would hope that Brazilian cattle came in, that stunning would continue, and so Australia is actually, Brazilian cattle will piggyback on Australian cattle and be stunned, which is a great animal welfare outcome. Agree, Michael? Yeah.
So if I can just add to that, it's really important. So I forget that nobody has lived 5 years in Vietnam. It's really important to understand that stunning is commonplace in Vietnam. We have introduced stunning to Vietnam, and it has been accepted and embraced almost ubiquitously throughout the supply chain, and is used openly, and it's penetrative stunning. So even if the stunner isn't working properly or fails, it still actually results in a really good stun and good animal welfare outcome. So in terms of animal welfare markets, they have embraced stunning, and it's a really a good market from that respect, and they use it on local cattle, and they will use it on Brazilian animals because it's just easier to do and obviously is good for animal welfare. And then also on the Brazilian, just the other point to note is that when we're talking about price comparison, we're actually talking about slaughter cattle that are currently going to Vietnam. I touched on feeders earlier, and the reality is, if you do the math, that if we bring feeders into Vietnam, then those feeders, through the gains that they'll get in the feedlot, will be more than competitive with Brazilian animals, and there would actually be no financial benefit for bringing the Brazilian cattle in. So that is obviously a focus of what we're trying to do, but affecting change in a market relies on not just us delivering training to them, because there's no point in us just delivering a ration and training. It involves working with our overseas partners through the exporters and importers and feedlotters and everybody to understand, or help them to understand how to capture that change and deliver that change with them, which is exceptionally difficult in Australia with Australian feedlotters and farmers, let alone in a foreign country where they don't have very many models to copy. So being able to do that is a huge challenge, especially when they have other constraints on them, and I touched on cash flow before. So look, this is an exceptionally challenging area to go. It's a huge opportunity for feeders to come in, and if we get feeders into Vietnam, then we won't have to worry about competitiveness with Brazil.
Another question from the floor.
Hi, I have a question about Indonesia. I'm aware that they have expanded their self-sufficiency policies to now include beef, whereby they want to reduce the dependency on imports of beef to Indonesia down to 10%. So 90% of the beef demand is produced in Indonesia. So I guess my first question is, and they hope to do that by 2025. So I guess my first question is, do you think that can be achieved? And if it is, or maybe even past 2025, what impact will that have on our live export industry?
Valeska, would you like to tackle that one?
Sure. So I'll probably say that if you see Indonesia as a whole nation, then yes, they are not yet self-sufficient in beef. But breaking it down into the different islands and the different provinces where beef is being produced, actually that most of the provinces are already self-sufficient in beef. So if you look at Bali, look at South Sulawesi, they are exporting beef inter-island. So I think where Australian cattle are coming in, they're actually complementing the beef production in Indonesia, and particularly our market, our destination is concentrated in the greater Jakarta area where most of the beef consumption is happening. So I think that certainly we understand and we support Indonesia's food security objectives, and that's what a lot of our work in Indonesia has been. Not just to improve their production, but also productivity and efficiency. The 2025 aspirations definitely is something that every country wants to be more food secure, have protein accessible and affordable for the people. The thing is that at the end of the day, that having the Australian cattle go over there is really about providing consumers with more choices. And we are not trying to feed everyone. We are certainly part of the food security agenda, whether it's at a bilateral level, at a regional level. At the end of the day, we are working with them, with Indonesian partners, to try and improve performance across the supply chain. And I don't think it's going to be an Indonesia-specific issue. I think food security is a global issue, particularly in the environment that we're living in with all the climate changes, etc.
Thank you. So, Indonesia, live cattle into Indonesia are only actually supplies about 20% of the total requirement. So it's not, we're not supplying everything. It's about 121,000 tonnes comes from the live animal production in Indonesia, about 550, 600,000 litre cattle, and they consume about 640,000 tonnes themselves. So only eating about 2.4 kilograms per person per year, so not a huge amount, but I think Valeska and I were talking yesterday, we would only need to see a 0.1 of a kilo increase, and that actually is about 100,000 cattle. So, you know, if Indonesia was to go to 3 kilograms and we eat 26 kilos here, if they'd gone to 3 kilos, it's another 500,000 cattle, and you know, look, it's about food security, so Australia probably wouldn't have been able to supply that. So obviously Indian buffalo meat is there and will continue to be there, but we've always got to remember that their local herd is there, and although it's probably a sustained level, it's not growing, but it's probably not decreasing either. But Indonesia is very, very keen to form partnerships, especially with Australia or with whoever might like to come and work with them, so that they can look at the other options to produce beef in Indonesia. And so look, there's a lot of you know, there's 13 or 14 million hectares of palm oil plantations in Indonesia, and so at the moment I think there's about 14 million hectares. It's all got grass underneath it. And I think there's around about 4,000 or 5,000 cattle. And there's a lot of exporters in the room here that have done some great things with those palm operations in Indonesia. It's slow, it's not going to happen overnight, but that will certainly help them with maybe not self-sufficiency, but with supplying more. Some more questions, please. Anyone? Surely someone wants to know where they can make an extra 5 cents supplying cattle. David Warriner, have you got any comments on the producer-feedlot relationship in coming out of the north, maybe?
Well, probably one comment. The crossbred cattle going up there, I know it's very difficult to sell composite cattle to the exporters. Sorry. Just in regard to the composite cattle out of the north into the live export trade, it is pretty difficult for cattle producers to sell composite cattle to the exporters. Now, we're hearing the importers in the market really want them, but it is certainly difficult. Like I just had 1,000 heifers, you know, drought mastery sort of heifers, and it took me about 3 months to move them. Very, very difficult this year just gone, because the exporters, I don't know what happens, but there seems to be a disconnect between the consumer, the importer and the exporter. Can you comment on that?
So is there other producers in the room that are having similar problems shifting composite type cattle or not? Yeah. And so are you having the same problem? Yeah. Brooke, can you comment on that?
Yeah, the market signals are not getting back. You know, it's obvious that it's not only in Australian feedlots, but in well-run Southeast Asian feedlots, the composite cattle are going to do marginally, if not more than marginally better in growth rates than our Brahman animals. But however, the customers want them. That is, the customers at the retail level, the feedlotters want them, but the exporters are not giving us those signals. And there's no such thing as a premium, but all we'd like is the demand for them, and then there would be the signal then to supply them. But we're not getting those signals, as David just said.
Dan, if there was more feedback of performance in feedlots and what customer wanted, like we were talking about before, do you think producers would be willing to, if they weren't already doing composite cattle, do more and things like that? Is that something that can be?
Anything. If it makes our cattle more saleable in the market, that is, in more demand, it's nice to get more cents per kilo, but I think the important thing is when there's a adequate supply of cattle, if you've got a breed that is in higher demand, it means you can move your animals sooner than, you know, sort of the alternative. So that's an advantage. But obviously, if it gets to the point where they're worth a few cents a kilo more, then of course we would swap as producers to producing a crossbred animal. And Northern Australia can, quite successfully, providing we don't go over 50%, we can, a crossbred animal will survive in Northern Australia. There's no problems with that, even in that tough sort of Catherine environment and above, you know.
Have we got a question from anyone from the schools? You know, do you guys understand what is happening in live export at the moment? How important it is to this area? Probably 400,000 cattle will leave Queensland this year to go overseas. Do you guys have an understanding of what's happening there or not? A question?
Just a question with Indonesia, with the change of government and the import quotas at the moment. Where's the emphasis on the reproductive heifers? Is that largely gone out the window, or is it still lurking in the background?
Good word, lurk. Yeah, look, it's still... Valeska, would you like to... So from what I've sort of heard, it's still... it's 5% of a licence. So each feedlotter applies for a licence, which they are issued with. And so you apply for 10,000 head, you've got to import 500 heifers. Is that what you're hearing, Valeska?
Yes, I think the government has changed the policy last month, or more a few months ago, and that at the moment they are requiring importers to bring in 5% of breeders for the import license. So we are working closely with the Indonesian Feedlotters Association and also the partners in Indonesia to work through what this means for producers and for other people along the supply chain. I think that that Indonesia's aspirations to be more food secure, that's really important, but we don't see or we feel that is not, that it shouldn't be tied to import conditions, that there is comparative advantages that Australia provides in terms of breeding, and Indonesia is very efficient in feeding. And I think that's the point that we need to get across more, especially with the new governments in Indonesia.
We've got about 2 minutes. Is there one more question? Tony Gooden?
Thanks, Greg. Just want to refer back to, because I think it's very important, David's point about the breeds of cattle that are required by the market. From my experience, principally Southeast Asia, the importers have to balance the type of cattle they import. They have to balance what animal will perform for them in the feedlot. Obviously, average daily weight gain and feed conversion ratios are a big driver for their profitability or efficiency. They have to balance that with what the customer wants. And you have to keep in mind that they are selling cattle, the importer that is, to the butcher or the slaughter abattoir on a live weight basis. So the feedback they get from their butcher customers is they want an animal that's reasonably fine boned, that's going to yield well. That's the secret for them, the high yield. So the beef yield compared to bone, skin, offal ratio. And invariably, and I know producers, obviously fertility is a key driver for their profitability, so therefore, anecdotally, crossbred cattle, some cross perform better on fertility because it's a key driver, but the customer ultimately, from the overwhelming demand that we experience, is for a higher grade content cattle, high content, preferably Brahman, with some Euro cross, which produces a lean carcass, not too big bone, and relatively thin skin. So I'm not sure that the market signals are being confused by the exporter. The market is the market. The importers demand what they want, and it's up to us as exporters to supply what they want. You know that as well as anyone, Greg. I'm not sure if that makes it clear, but when we're buying cattle and we're doing a shipment just about every week, overwhelmingly the safest animal is a high-grade, high-content Bos indicus animal with a fair bit of content that can handle those hot humid conditions. Now, it varies from customer to customer and area to area, but overwhelmingly that's the core demand that we have.
Yeah, no, that's, it's obviously what you're feeding and what time of the year and what the temperature is too. So there's heat, especially in Vietnam. We've got a pretty constant temperature in Indonesia, but Vietnam has a up and down. So look, I think that's the end of the day. Thank you very much. Sorry for those few interruptions during the day, but if they happen again, you'll know exactly what's happening. So look, thank you very much for the panel, and I hope we've answered a few questions. Thank you.